Welcome to the Writing 2 presentation on document design. Please follow along in your textbook by looking at Chapter 50. I strongly recommend that you do this. I know oftentimes with these presentations you can probably get as much as you need out of them without really looking in the textbook, even though you should be doing the reading along with everything else for your work for the week. And when we design the course, we include time designated for you to be doing your reading. However, in this chapter it's going to be particularly important because they have a lot of really good examples in the textbook, and they have specific examples of design that you can look at that I'm not really able to put into this presentation because I don't have access to those actual examples. So I want you to make sure that you can use your textbooks. If you don't have access to a textbook, please contact me as soon as possible so that I can work with you somehow. One of the first aspects we think of when we do think about document design is images. And there are a couple of different kinds of images that you can use. I'm taking a slightly different approach from the book. What the book has is really good regarding images, but again, it's a little tough for me to use that without showing the examples. So make sure that you read the book about this. Not to keep beating on that point, but you should know. We have a couple of different kinds of images. One would be informative images. So these are images that you can explain and use in your text. And an example of that I see in student papers often is, for example, if you're providing information about the number of drug busts in each county in Indiana. And we have a lot of papers over the years about drug abuse and things like that, or specific types of drugs. So sometimes you'll find an image that has others and to show how dangerous a certain county is as far as drugs, or how many drug busts were done in a county, and it might have the number of drug busts in this particular year for that county. Maybe it came from the Indiana State Police if you're from Indiana. They used to put something like that out. So that would be an example of an informative image because it's got information in it and you can learn something from looking at it. When you do that, you should caption it. So put something like Figure 1 or Table 4, and then that way when you refer to it in your paper or other project, you can say, as seen in Figure 1 or as seen in Table 4, and that makes it a little bit more professional the way that you refer to it. When you're building documents for specifically online use, you can use what's called alternative text, and that will actually describe that informative image for people who may not be. Sometimes people who are visually impaired use what's called a screen reader or other things, especially to view documents online, and so those screen readers will actually look for alternative text whenever they run across an image, and so you want to put that in. That's an element of really good online design. If you're doing this for writing 2, we probably don't have too much use of the alternative text in there, but this is something good for you to know as you move forward in other classes and projects. We also have decorative images. These are just to keep readers interested and not necessarily to understand the content. You've probably noticed in the presentations that I build for this class, I tend to use a lot of decorative images just to keep you all engaged, as I say here. And so I'll throw a picture of a goat or students because those are interesting to you, hopefully, at least more interesting than blank space. So hopefully you understand when you run across these decorative images that I don't usually have a ton of meaning. Sometimes I have my own inside jokes that amuse me when I'm putting these presentations together, but usually they're just for decoration. So hopefully that helps you understand the two different types of images you might include. Professional document design should be simple and uncluttered. You should make key information stand out. And one way that you might do that is by using bullet points. You'll notice probably that I use a lot of bullet points in my presentations for you all because that helps information stand out more than it would in a paragraph. And you want your readers to be able to find information easily, work through the document without missteps, in other words, getting lost or not understanding what they're seeing, and then also kind of get a feel for the structure that you're using. So of course, bigger ideas would be in bigger print, and then you would use smaller print for the material. So again, you can just see on this particular screen I have two major bullet points, and they have a certain size of font, but then under the second bullet point here it's smaller font, and that shows it's less important than what's up above it in terms of the structure of the document. You'll also notice, of course, that the heading itself is even bigger. So by using this sort of simple and uncluttered look, this will help your readers be able to find information an awful lot easier. You also want to make sure that the design is logical and consistent. What that means is it makes sense and you use the same types of things consistently. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, the size of the headings are going to be consistent to the importance of the heading. So if you have a main heading, it'll be bigger. If you have a subheading, it'll be smaller. And you kind of use those same structural things throughout the design of the document in a consistent way. The same with columns. Sometimes people like to throw things like columns and tables in more to just have a diversity in design, and there's a certain philosophy behind that, but make sure that you are really only using those things as needed and in a way that makes sense for your readers. Same with navigational links. Sometimes you'll run into documents where there are navigational links for all kinds of things that maybe readers don't need, and it's like somebody's trying to show off that they know how to make a link to something out on the internet when they really don't need to. As you get more progressed with this and learn more about this and use this in different settings, you'll start getting a better sense for when you need to put in navigational links. Oftentimes you'll put those in, maybe there's a term that needs to be defined or to a different organization that people might need to. There are times also where you're going to link to different things within your own document, or you might have a folder set up with a lot of different documents, and you would need to put links to those different documents so that if a reader is reading through your own document, they would need to click and go look at that other document that you're referring to. And if you want to ever talk about this, I can give you more examples and really nerd out over this, but hopefully this at least gives you a sense of knowing that you need to have a plan and have a structure behind this, not just do it kind of randomly and because you think it'll look fancier if you do it a lot more. Design should also be balanced. What that means is that whatever you're using, whether it's text or images or things like that, you're going to have those put in places where the document so that it kind of evens out on both sides. You're not going to want to keep everything pushed to a side. I know that for a regular academic document, you left justify everything, and that's what's appropriate for that field. But as you start using more columns, or which we discussed a minute ago, or if you're using tables, if you're using images, things like that, you don't want to just put everything off to the left or to the right. You need to kind of put them throughout the document so it looks a little bit balanced out, and that'll go easier on the eyes and help readers draw readers to the specific things they need as well. You also then you want to think about if things are symmetrical. In other words, they're sort of even on both sides. They're never going to be exactly balanced and symmetrical, but it's something to strive for. You want to use common sense when using templates. Templates can be really nice because they're pre-designed and they've got some of these elements already in place that we've talked about, things that we've talked about so far, that look good together and maybe have a good consistency and a good balance like we've talked about. And you can often get these from Microsoft Office. You do want to use them in a way that makes sense though, and there are times where a template might look really good, but once you start using it, it's really impractical. So you don't want to try to keep fitting your information just because you happen to have a template for it. Eventually you want to learn how to design things for yourself. But if you do use a template, use common sense with it, but hopefully that will help you make it turn out better. Let's talk about color coordination here. Now, this can be a little bit of a complicated topic sometimes. Sometimes it comes down to artistic choice. Remember that document design, though, is not for you to show off how artistic you are in general. It's for you to think about your audience and your readers and what will help them read through the document most efficiently and what's going to look most professional. So keep in mind that you don't want to rely on color for meaning in informational graphics, which we talked about earlier. Part of the reason is that users might print them off in black and white or might have visual impairments where they don't see color very well. So you don't want to assume that they do it. So, for example, you wouldn't want to use bold. That's usually something that's going to stand out more if you're trying to provide meaning for something that is more important. For text, you want to avoid bright and pale fonts because people aren't going to see those very well, whether they're up against a black or a white background. If you're talking about designing for the web, you want to make sure that you only have really light background colors. And usually documents that are designed in a professional environment, they're going to work best with white because that's a lot easier for people to print. It's not going to stress their printers out. It's not going to create some visual problems for try to look. Now, back in the day, I learned web design back when I was early on in college in the mid-90s, and my own college journey was very long and winding road, you could say. So it seems a little longer ago than you might think, but we learned a lot about things like web design, and it was really fun. And we learned HTML coding and stuff like that. But one of the things that was rampant back in the late 90s, early 2000s for websites, you can go from laughable examples. Back then, people were starting to learn how to do web design, and we started getting these abilities to put together websites without having to learn code. And you saw all kinds of crazy websites with wacky background colors and images, and it's kind of hilarious to look at it now, but back then we took it very seriously and we wanted something that looked really cool. But one of the things that people realize is when they would eventually go to print it out, it was really hard to read. Even sometimes read on a screen, but especially when they would print it out. So be careful about using things that you might think are really clever, but might get in the way of people actually being able to read and understand the text. As you start designing more professional documents, and as you start designing academic documents that might need headings, you want to be sure that you know how to use them properly. The best practice is to only use them in longer papers, which you are starting to use them now in longer papers. And APA format tends to be a lot more friendly to headings than MLA. APA actually encourages that. So what is the best practice for academic documents is only in longer papers. Again, you may run into papers for other instructors where they want headings and they want you to do that in more of an APA format for a shorter paper. That's fine. Go with instructor once, obviously. You want to use major points from your outline as your headings. That seems to be common sense, but sometimes I see choices where students will have like a longer heading that's like a line from their paper. No, use a major point. Use it to be fairly short and brief. And again, some fields or documents may require headings, and we'll let you know that as part of the format. With a professional document, you can actually differentiate between the required sections. And what that means is that you're using them instead of a transition. That's somewhat true for academic world as well, but remember that in a professional document, trying to crank out a document that has a certain number of pages, you're trying to be clear and relatively concise. So by adding those transitions, that's really good writing, but that's not necessarily what's needed in a professional document. So those headings will take the place of those transitions, because otherwise the transitions kind of slow down your reader. And again, they help with navigation. And as you get more practice with doing documents, you'll actually find yourself using headings as a way to skim and see what's in information within different parts of a document. So you may even skip parts of a document if you can see by the heading it doesn't have what you really need. And for a much longer document in the professional world, you could even do a table of contents at the beginning that would then you would create links to your different headings so that somebody could just look at the table of contents and cut straight to the budget info first, or whatever. If they're going back and referring to your document and want to look for something, they don't need everything, they might use that table of contents and click a link and go right there for it. Again, if you would like to see an example of this, contact me. I know we all have different fields we're getting into, but I'm happy to work through an example of some of this stuff with you in person if you would like. Again, as we mentioned in a previous slide, heading items should be parallel in importance and section significance. So in other words, don't use headings for really short things. Again, make sure that you're somewhat balanced in your structure here. Finally, let's talk about fonts. There are people who really get in depth, and I hate to use the term nerd out, but I think they would use that, and they get really into fonts. And I love those people. Those people are awesome, and we can all learn a lot from them. You don't have to go to that depth just to write a document, but you do need to know some basics. First one is knowing serif versus sans serif. And I'm going to make sure that if you're taking my course that you have some links to some more in-depth explanation on these things. Of course, the book has an in-depth explanation that will help you and has some good examples, so I don't feel the need to do that in this presentation. Just refer to the other resources for that. Know that in an academic paper, you need to use one font in the same size throughout. And that's something that sometimes students struggle with because they want to have a nice huge title and they want to do other things to make it look fancy. But in an academic paper, you really want to just be consistent with everything. In a professional document, you can use different fonts and size to contrast and emphasize. But again, you need to really go easy on this. You need to really be err on the side of caution, as they say. You don't want to throw around a bunch of fonts just to show off. Again, this used to be the case on websites. People would just try to show off how many fonts they could use in one document, and it was confusing. It was like hearing a bunch of different voices saying different things all at the same time, if that makes sense. It's a little bit difficult to read documents if people keep changing fonts and there's no real reason for it. So you want to choose fonts to contrast and emphasize. So one way people might do that is they would put the heading in a different font to show contrast. You might notice that often in my presentations, sometimes I'm not great about being consistent about this, but I try to have font so that the heading font contrasts with the font in the body. And sometimes the philosophy is that you would use more of a sans serif font up in the top heading and then a serif font for writing, because people tend to read that a little bit easier for reasons you can read in the book and see elsewhere. I flip it around and use it differently. Part of that has to do with a style design that was in place for the college when I first started doing these types of documents, and that was the expectation. And I just sort of kept doing that just to be consistent. But that's something that as you get into an organization, sometimes they'll have a specific type of font style design that they want you to use. Keep in mind that there are some display and decorative fonts that would not be good for reading, and sometimes people will use these for chapter titles or something like that. But keep in mind those are very difficult to use. And again, you can learn more about these elsewhere probably. Just be aware that those exist. Consider your audience. When you're designing a document that's going to be passed around electronically, keep in mind that if you go out and get some specialized fonts, other people are not going to have those fonts on their computers, so they're just going to show up, and you may not have control over how they show up. It may screw up your format a lot. So for example, and you can go out there, if you don't know how to do this, might be something fun to play around with. If you're ever making like flyers or posters or something, and you want to use really creative fonts, you can do this. I've gone out and downloaded fonts that I like to use that, especially for Halloween, things that look like, blood dripping or whatever, or icicles if I'm, doing some kind of a tribute to Frozen or whatever. So there are different reasons that you might want to go out and find really cool, fancy fonts and some people spend a lot of time designing these, and you can find some really awesome stuff out there. But if you send that in a document, like a Microsoft Word document or a Publisher document, or, for example, if I were doing that in PowerPoint and then I sent it on to somebody else, or if you make something on your computer and you have all these awesome fonts because you're really into that, that's awesome. But then when you go show up to present it at a conference or you go to present it at work, keep in mind that that computer will not have that font on it. So it's not going to have the effect that you want. Now, there are a couple of ways to get around that. One is to save the font as an image and write the thing in the font in like Microsoft Paint or something, and then save it as an image and put it into your presentation as an image. Sometimes, though, that doesn't work out as well, especially when you're looking at it on a big screen in a presentation. Take it from me. So you want to be really careful about doing that stuff. Also, try to avoid the font Comic Sans. That got a reputation as being just really silly and not appropriate for professional, and so people will often cringe when they see that. Hopefully this has been at least a little bit of a nice introduction for fonts. I know we spent a lot of time on this, but this is something where sometimes students really want to think that they're going to impress me with fonts, and it ends up being disastrous when they really should have just used something more professional. And I feel bad for them because I appreciate that they wanted to do something really cool and creative, but it ends up spending a lot of time and not really having the desired effect. So hopefully this has been helpful. Thank you for watching, everybody. As you know, we use this book for a source for this presentation, and I highly encourage you to read the chapter. I also included some things from this presentation that I've learned in my own training for what's called information architecture and design. And I also have taken some training in something called Quality Matters. And what that refers to is online course design. That's something that I've focused a lot on over the last year. So we haven't seen it really implemented in my classes, the college's classes, a ton yet, but that's something that we are going to work really hard on over the next few years. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Let me know if you have any questions about this, and I'm glad to help.